Okay, so we actually are expecting Josh to show up at some point halfway through this, and he was supposed to moderate this. So we're kind of winging it a little bit to start with. We're going to do some introductions and then talk a little bit about kind of each of our roles in kind of safety disclosure and what our experiences have been, and then kind of take it from there. My name is Jay Radcliffe. I am currently a cybersecurity researcher at Boston Scientific who makes medical devices. And my big experience with this as a patient, I am a type 1 diabetic and have used medical devices of various types for a long period of time, probably the last 20 years since my diagnosis. And I have a very intimate relationship with medical devices and their safety because I depend on them every day to keep me healthy and to keep me alive. And it has incorporated that into my career as somebody who is a medical device hacker, as somebody that looks at the safety and security from a software and technology perspective of medical devices. And that's kind of my role in this field and in the industry.
Hi, I'm Suzanne Schwartz from the FDA Center for Devices and Radiological Health. And before I talk about the FDA, really what I wanted to do was take a few moments on behalf of FDA to recognize, to really acknowledge the work that Am The Cavalry has done over the past 5 years, and to really state how important the contributions are that all the security researchers have contributed to the medical device ecosystem. We highly value that work. It is extraordinarily important to advancing medical device cybersecurity and moving the ecosystem along. And so we want to congratulate Am The Cavalry for that work, and we look forward to ongoing efforts, particularly in that shared mission space of safer, sooner together. So with that, just a little bit of framing around background of FDA's work in medical device cybersecurity. Our emphasis has been very much on building the community, on really building that collective and that collaborative atmosphere. And it's as a result of really trying to do that kind of convening and giving every stakeholder a voice, a seat at the table, that our ability to formulate policy has gotten to where it is at present. And when I speak about formulating policy, I'm talking about the guidances that we have published for both the pre-market side of cybersecurity, in other words, prior to devices going on the market, as well as throughout the rest of the product life cycle, post-market, once the device is actually in its clinical use. But this has been a very arduous journey, one that we at FDA have been learning as we go, along with all of our partners. And there have been, a fair number of hiccups and challenges along the way. Very much a part of what does it take to mature an ecosystem, to mature the sector in an area that it has been at a very rudimentary level as of at least a few years ago. And granted, we've seen a fair amount of progress, but it's more than just taking the tools that we're able to deploy out of FDA, the tools out of our toolbox, but rather what does it take to change culture? What does it mean to change hearts and minds and to really bring everyone together? And that's where utilizing the research community has been so very, very important. And a good example of that has been in the coordinated vulnerability disclosure space. So that is a really good illustration of how FDA came to really understand the importance of manufacturers and others adopting disclosure policies and making those policies public and available and transparent to researchers and other identifiers, and to have processes in place for intake and handling as well. So while we have seen some good steps, some good progress forward with respect to adoption of disclosure policies and coordination around vulnerability disclosure. There's still a long ways to go. Then we can talk about what some of the difficulties and challenges are as we continue with this panel. But I'll hand it over now to Nina.
Hi, can you hear me? You can't hear me. Can you hear me now? Better? Super good? Okay, so I'm going to hold it like this and look awesome the whole time. Good? No. Let's do this. Can you hear me now? Okay. So I'm Nina. I own the DEF CON Biohacking Village, and one of the one of the medical devices that I work on is the electronic medical record, which in my eyes is the ultimate record. It's the ultimate medical device, but it's not actually considered a medical device. My main issue with it is that it's built on a lot of antiquated technologies. And this year, with the Biohacking Village, what we decided to do was to build it out. So under normal circumstances, last year, the year before that, the year before that, it was a lot of security talks. Everything was someone up there giving a presentation. And last year, we were looking at the situation thinking, this isn't the whole ecosystem. This is not everything that happens with medical. So how do we make this better, and how do we make it whole? So what we did this year was create a medical device village along with the talks and a wet lab. So building all of that out, it gives the researchers a better idea of how medical actually works, and you can get your hands dirty and touch everything and get in there, deal with, talk to the manufacturers, get better insight into what they're doing, how you can help, things like that. So just touching on what you said, some of the challenges that we have normally faced is trust. How can the manufacturers trust us as hackers, information researchers, to give them the right information, and how do we get them to trust that we're giving them the right information so that they can maintain the integrity and the safety of these devices? So since we don't have a moderator, my question back this way is, as a patient and as part of Boston Scientific, how do you guys deal with that? And then how does the FDA further accommodate things like that?
Well, from the Boston Scientific perspective, we're just kind of starting this cybersecurity program there. And, it's very interesting. When they brought me in, they gave me this large list of legacy devices. And they said, we need to make sure these legacy devices are safe, but we also need to make sure that the devices that we're making going forward are safe. And we're seeing a huge demand from healthcare delivery organizations. They don't want to buy devices that are insecure. That's crazy, right? They actually are doing their homework, and they're asking lots of questions of us of how we are testing these devices. How are we guaranteeing that these devices that they're buying are going to be secure not only now, but secure going forward for the next 5, 10, 15 years even. Because medical devices are not something that are like your cell phone. They don't get replaced every year and a half. There's something that usually lasts a long time. And that industry is used to having devices last for 10, 15 years. So when they make that investment, they want to know that those things are going to be updated and secure going forward. Now, this presents a large problem, because there really isn't an operating system out there that gets support for 10 to 15 years. And when we look at a lot of these new medical device technologies, a lot of them are being built on the backs of things like Android devices. And Android devices have even a shorter period of time of lifespan. If the average lifespan of an Android phone or a tablet is about a year and a half. And if you know anything about the medical device world, it takes longer than a year and a half just to develop a medical device. So it's a very big challenge to us as a manufacturer to build these devices and to make sure they're secure and supportable as they go out into the field, as they go out into patients' hands, to make sure that they are indeed secure and stable and usable for that entire lifetime that they've looked at.
So to add on to that from FDA's perspective, let's start off from where our mission is, which is to protect and promote the public health. And so we look at cybersecurity of medical devices through the lens of patient safety, recognizing that if there were to be an exploit to certain types of vulnerabilities of devices that could affect the performance or the function of that device, then that patient's health can be in jeopardy. That patient could suffer some kind of consequence. Or even worse yet, it could be more than one patient. It could be a number of patients or a mass number of patients. So when we think about it from that point of view, it's important for us also in a lot of the outreach and the multi-stakeholder engagement and the educating and the building awareness that we've been doing to really underscore those principles of what we're talking about here with regard to FDA's mission and FDA's specific emphasis on assuring that these devices are not left with exposed vulnerabilities that can lead to the kinds of hacks or attacks that can endanger patients. Coming back, though, Nina, to your question, I think a lot of this is, again, focusing on building or creating an environment of trust, of respect and of empathy among different stakeholders. And without those factors, the ability to share information and to be transparent about sharing that information really just sort of unravels. So that is really very much key to what we have invested a lot of energy and a lot of effort in doing, and it's with growing pains. There's no question around that. We've seen some disclosures that have gone very smoothly, where there has been really great dialogue across the different parties and communication that's been very much aligned to the public, and there have been others where there have been quite a few hiccups. So I think the other piece that's really important to emphasize here as well is that it's not merely about the disclosure per se. You know, the disclosure is critical, but built into that concept, that's not the outcome, the endpoint. Built into that is really the means by which one gets to full management of that vulnerability and making sure that the vulnerability is being addressed appropriately from the standpoint of whether mitigations, controls, or remediation need to be put in place in order to appropriately, again, manage that vulnerability. So disclosure is certainly the mechanism by which to do that, but I wouldn't want, FDA would not want the industry and all stakeholders to lose sight of the forest for the trees here in terms of it's not merely about a checking the box exercise in disclosing.
Did you want to say something? Because I have another question.
Go for it.
Okay. So one of the things that happens, let's say you go to the hospital because you're having a heart issue, right? They don't walk up to you and say, okay, here are all the pamphlets of all the pacemakers we have. Here's their contact phone number for support. You got about 5 hours. Let us know how you feel. Call them. Choose the one you want. We're good to go. We're going to send you into surge, right? It's an emergency. You have to be in surge within 2 to 3 hours to make sure that you're living. So with that, devices go into humans, which don't get instant updates, and patients aren't very fully aware of what these things are, of what the devices are that are attached to them. They just know that the doctor gave it to me, it's going to work, I'm going to be fine. So how do we better ensure that as medical, information security, and technologists, how do we better accomplish this, and what's the educational process?
It's a good question. I think that one of the things that I've seen a huge amount of growth in is the amount of questions that I get asked and the amount of inquiries that we get from medical professionals. I've had some recent privileges of being on technical expert boards with doctors, and they have become a lot more aware of these things. And I think it's because not only have we had some success in media in talking about some of these issues publicly, but I also think that it's kind of creeping into their minds just because of the way that technology is running. You know, I mentioned cell phones. And one of the new technologies that I'm seeing is the cell phone is going to be the bridge between the medical device and the cloud. And that's how all of the data that the patient generates is going to be communicated. And doctors are incredibly smart, intuitive people. They know, my cell phone drops calls all the time and does weird things and can get malware on it. And now it's going to be responsible for doing things with these medical devices. And I've got some questions about that, because I don't trust my cell phone to make credit card payments, yet I'm going to put my faith in this cell phone in patients, to keep track of pain stimulators, of keeping track of cardio devices and cardio rhythm devices. And we see this technology being used more and more, and doctors are starting to question, is this safe? Whereas before, it was very abstract. It was very proprietary, where you had to be within 6 inches of the device to communicate with it with a programmer. Those are older technologies, and now we're putting Bluetooth into everything. And these things are familiar to doctors. And I think that we've done our part in helping to educate them, but I also think that it's just the proliferation of technology that they're familiar with and that they have questionable experiences with. I think that all of us in the room can understand how maybe we can question maybe our cell phone not being the most stable device that we've ever used, or our Bluetooth headset that connects to our phone or our car. Maybe that's not the safest and best way to go. But it's not to say that it's not safe, but doctors are asking those questions to determine if those types of devices are safe to use. So I am seeing a lot more doctors asking questions about that technology. And even though patients might not have the immediate decision-making capability, whether to choose their device or not, or to choose to have that device have Bluetooth capability or not, there's certainly doctors looking out for their patients' safety in that regard.
So that's very encouraging. We haven't seen that significant in terms of progress with all across the clinical community, but I think that you're seeing signs of that, particularly in the cardiology or the cardio interventionalists. Mm-hmm. And it is our plan to target other parts of the clinical community over the course of the next year, in order to, again, better inform and better empower physicians around the technologies, and so that they're better positioned to have that kind of an informed conversation or dialogue with patients. We think that educating patients is really critical here. And that because those dialogues also are happening between the patient and the provider, it is important that the providers feel a level of confidence in what it is that they're able to communicate, and that they could put it in language that a patient can understand and can make together with their physician a decision based upon what's put in front of them in terms of devices. So this is an area in terms of communications and better education that FDA, working together with different clinical societies, working together with various patient groups, is going to be really important as we go forward.
I have more questions. So, shameless plug time. Am The Cavalry does a cyber security summit. They did one in Arizona, and we did one in New York. So, where we talk about the emergency preparedness of medical facilities, hospitals, ambulatory centers, things like that. So, I know you were involved in it. Are you? No? Okay. So, essentially what happens is we escalate the situation. At first, one computer goes down, you find out there's some ransomware, and then by the end, there's mass chaos, havoc. It's amazing. You ever get the opportunity to go? You should. So what lessons can we learn from mass emergency medical downtime, and how do we ensure patient safety with disclosure of ransomware and breaches from the hospital systems or the ambulatory systems?
Are you asking me?
I'm asking both of you.
Okay. That's a good question.
Loaded question.
Hospitals tend to be a little bit understaffed and behind when it comes to their IT technology. And there's a lot of struggle that goes on in that ecosphere of even having a solid inventory of all the devices that are in your environment. And being prepared for that is something that is a very scary situation, because I don't think a lot of hospitals are prepared for it, in my experience. Not only from my years of consulting, working at hospitals and working with hospitals, it makes me very nervous to see, the amount of devices that go unpatched, the amount of, I know we have a lot of devices. I don't know where they all sit, and I don't know how many are vulnerable right now because we can't scan them. We can't do that type of technology because they're in patient use. And devices that are 10 to 15 years old, they don't react well to scanners, and they don't react well to a lot of the modern technology. And when you have somebody hooked up to a respirator or an infusion pump, and you scan it and it decides to reboot and take 5 minutes to do that, you might harm the patient. And that's something that I think that every hospital and every medical device, everything in medical centers around the patient and making sure the patient is safe. So that's not a risk that they're willing to take. So they are often not as prepared, which is why you see this chaos that comes up when you have things like, there's some malware that's spread across the entire hospital and locked up all the medical records. So now we can't figure out what blood type this person is, or we can't figure out what their diagnosis is, and they might be in a coma. So it's a very troubling situation, and it's a very scary situation.
And that's why it becomes really important to do exercises, right? To be involved in preparedness, response, recovery, resilience, exercises that focus on simulations where you have a cyber attack of sorts, or different kinds of simulations and scenarios. We think that this is really very important, and hospitals, as part of their hospital preparedness programs, do this for other types of hazards all the time. What we need to do, and what is happening actually, is building that same kind of programming and exercising for cyber-related functions too. So do stay tuned on that, because FDA has been working with MITRE and with 2 states, with New York and Massachusetts, on pilots in terms of putting together what are playbooks for cyber preparedness and response that will then be utilized even to exercise and to iterate around what the gaps are and how to shore up some of those gap areas. But clearly we can't leave hospitals with the a lack of ability to respond effectively when they are hit by some kind of an attack.
Is it in New York City?
Yes, it involves New York City as well.
So I'd like to talk about one thing real quick. Since we're talking about disclosure, I think it's really important to note how far we've come in disclosure. 7 years ago, I gave a talk at Black Hat where I hacked into my own insulin pump. And at that time, the state of disclosure was pretty chaotic. I didn't feel comfortable enough going to the manufacturer to disclose that before my talk, because I knew that their reaction would be to sue me, and I would never get to do the talk, and people would never get to hear about the vulnerabilities that I found in my medical device. That was 7 years ago. Today, and last year, I disclosed the same type of vulnerability to a different insulin pump manufacturer at Johnson & Johnson. And I was able to do that very comfortably and go to them and say, I found vulnerabilities. And they said, great, we have a vulnerability intake program, and we want to work with you and make sure that we address these issues correctly and safely. And the process took us over 6 months, but the end result was me as a researcher coming out with the manufacturer and saying, these are the problems that were identified, these are the solutions to get around it. And patients should not be overly concerned with the day-to-day operation of these devices. And if they feel especially threatened, like if they were a president of a country, or if they maybe were unwilling to take those risks, I don't like to use the term tinfoil hat people, but these risks are very low probability but very high impact. You can turn some of those features off and not have that risk present in your life. And that was impossible 7 years ago. It was completely and totally impossible. And because of the work that the FDA has done, because of the work that the Cavalry has done, because of the work that a lot of researchers and medical device vendors have done, we've reached a better state. It is not perfect. It is not something that we can just say, great, we're done with it. We don't have to do any more work on this. There's still a lot of work to be done to make it better, but man, has it come a far way. And as a researcher, that makes me a lot more comfortable doing my disclosures and doing my research. We've even gone as far as to getting exemptions to the Digital Millennium Copyright Act to make sure that researchers that are doing good can do the type of research that's needed on these medical devices. 7 years ago, when I did research on my own medical device, I had to do it with one hand tied behind my back because I didn't want to risk going to jail. That was not part of the plan. And I wanted to make sure that good guys had as much ground to explore and to research as the bad guys did, or as adversaries did. And now we've reached that state where we can do that type of research without having to worry about prosecution under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. Now we still, again, it is not perfect. We have a ways to go with things like the CFAA and other types of legislation and laws that might impact a researcher's ability to do research and to disclose. But again, we've come a long way. And I want to recognize that we've come a long way, and things have gotten a lot better from that perspective.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, and we really make a point of applauding the behavior of medical device manufacturers that have engaged in coordinated disclosure and really in being able to work in such a collaborative manner with researchers and with government agencies in terms of being able to communicate like that. I think that where we want to be, in terms of setting goals for the next 12 months, is to see even greater adoption across manufacturers, because we have more than a handful. I'd say we have 2 handfuls of manufacturers that are champions in this arena. They are really at the leading edge, and they've really put themselves on the line, I have to say, with regard to disclosures, because the media or the press doesn't necessarily understand or perceive right now that making those kinds of disclosures is actually a sign of greater maturity and of transparency. And those manufacturers often do get dinged and pointed to as the ones that have vulnerabilities, when we know that every manufacturer, every product, every medical device has vulnerabilities. So one of the challenges that we see as we go forward in this next year, in this next phase actually, is trying to get a better grasp on what are the hurdles, what are the perceived obstacles, what's hindering medical device manufacturers, the bulk of them, from actually adopting these policies and participating in coordinated disclosure. And as we get a better understanding of that, there are going to be various white papers and playbooks that are being put out by different groups within the healthcare sector to try to help address this issue from different angles, so that, again, hopefully by next year at this time, it won't be 15 manufacturers of the thousands that you have in the ecosystem, but there will be maybe, I don't know, maybe 100 or so. That would be really nice to see.
I have a question for you, Nina. I didn't know if you wanted to talk about what kind of protections that you put in place in the biohacking village for coordinated vulnerabilities that are disclosed or that are found during that process.
It's more of a Bo question. Bo is the lead on the medical device village, so I'm going to hand it to you.
Thanks.
Turn
Turn it on?
It's an on button.
Do I have to turn it on always? Okay. I'll go stand in your eye line better. Yeah, so we spent about 18 months working through how we're going to do the medical device village this year at Biohacking Village, and have gone through some pretty great pains to make sure that we strike a good balance. One of the things we don't want to be is something like the voting village was, where you have a bunch of bad actors. The voting machine makers don't want to improve the security of their devices. They see them as secure enough already. And so the voting village had to go out and get a lot of negative press. We want to work with people who are doing good things to get positive press out of it. So shifting the mindset from one of exposing bad practice to really an educational learning environment, a safe space for collaboration, for trust building, for understanding and empathy is our goal. So to that, some of the things we put in place are like labeling for all the devices. So, here's the disclosure policy, or here's a link to the disclosure policy, or, this device is not on the market anymore, it's for educational purposes only, or, bringing in the medical device makers themselves to help set up the lab, to run it so that they can be literally face-to-face with the person finding the issue. So you cut the threshold to reporting to almost zero. And we've done a number of things like that. I think that some of the biggest breakthroughs that we've had are the medical device makers themselves, who some of them proactively reached out to us when they heard about it, and they were like, hey, we want to be a part of this. Like, how can we come? Will you let us set up in there and talk to folks? We're like, yes. So I think that's emblematic of the industry change, that it's not just us who has to put the protections in place, which we have done a lot of, but it's also the industry themselves wanting to lean into security rather than lean away from it. And there's other things we've done, like working with some of the third-party disclosure groups who are able to triage some of those vulnerabilities. Art Mannion's going to be there from CertCC and help with some of that. We've got some good informational materials that we're going to give out that give you a good, clear pathway to reporting issues. So it's not just, hey, find something and then go, out to the media. We've got at DEF CON generally this year, there's a ban on recording, and we took it a step further. We said we have for press, it's default deny by exception only. We'll work with press to come in there. Because we want to make sure that the story is right and accurate and not sensational and overly dramatic. Nobody wants a bunch of FUD out there, least of all people who are trying to build trust in the industry and in the ecosystem. So that's a lot of the things. I'm probably forgetting a few of them because my brain is kind of fried right now, planning this for the past few months.
Great, thank you. Josh, you want to join us? No? You heard it's covered. All right. Yeah, if you got a question, sure.
Yeah, I was wondering how you all thought the vulnerabilities equities process kind of fit into all of this.
The vulnerabilities
Equities
process? Can you explain that for everybody?
Perhaps we could have a government representative explain it.
If okay, let's see. FDA has not had visibility, nor has HHS, on the vulnerability equities process. So, the concept behind it, and Sean, you may be in a better position to explain it than I can, but the concept behind it is to make sure that with respect to vulnerabilities that were they to be exploited could be, highly catastrophic from a national security perspective, that those vulnerabilities be kept within very constrained circles within government, and that in certain cases the manufacturers would not be aware of those vulnerabilities, and that they can be used even potentially in an offensive manner as well.
So that's a fantastic explanation, much better than I could have. Thank you for taking the time to say that, and also for all the fantastic work you and the others here have done. So I'm not going to go into names, but you all know who you are. But yeah, I just wanted to throw those 3 little words out there and see what folks thought.
Yeah.
So how do you envision the federal versus state versus local role in managing risk caused by vulnerabilities in not just medical devices, but IT systems and hospitals generally? So obviously the FDA has the post-market guidance, but how do you see states coming into play?
So from a response perspective, this is where our working on what we're calling this regional playbook becomes important, in that there is infrastructure, there's response infrastructure that is in place at HHS's level of the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response, what's known as ASPR. And ASPR has connections, into the states through what are called regional coordinators. And those regional coordinators also cross into the different states' public health departments, as well as with hospitals as well. What we're proposing is that education has to, and that linkage needs to expand again beyond what are all hazards types of responses for which that ASPR network has been set up, so that the parties that would be engaged from a response standpoint really understand what it means to deal in the moment with a cyber-related type of an attack as well. So it would leverage that same type of a network. What we've done also through the work thus far in building a playbook and in reaching out to states is to have discussions with those states' departments of public health, as well as with various parts of the regional coordinators there and with the hospitals. Just again, taking even lessons learned from there, and leveraging those.
So you see it as mostly a right of boom role, not much in terms of managing risk on the front.
Yeah, I would say so.
It's just knowing what you do for the National Governors Association. I would say slightly beyond the coordinated vulnerability disclosure or the disclosure process. What we're finding, at least in we did the Congressional Task Force for Healthcare Cybersecurity, as you know, but for the rest of the room, one of the things we found was while medical device makers are starting to add coordinated disclosure, while we're decriminalizing research from the hacker community, while Suzanne and her team are trying to improve the state of the art and the minimum entrance criteria and ongoing care and feeding of medical devices, the last mile seems to be the hospitals. And one of the things I think a role for the National Governors Association or for the state and local is to try to drive things like our Cyber Med Summit, where we did clinical hacking simulations and tabletop exercises with state and local government and hospital administrators to have a very visceral and palpable experience on how underprepared they are for this new form of weakness against accidents and adversaries. So I wanted to see like a 50-state initiative, or maybe go to the major cities in the U.S. that have some sort of mecca around medical, like Boston area, Minneapolis, Cedars-Sinai in LA, but the people that see themselves as leaders in this profession, were they to start doing this because their governor asked them to, or their mayor got involved and took a personal interest in disaster recovery or preparedness or some sort of national security exercise, I think it would create fertile soil for all the great work that you've already heard of today. So I think their role is really to be a better receiver of the good information, and to date we haven't really leveraged that, because we, at least from the cavalry's perspective, we found it hard enough to try to break through into federal government, let alone 50 states or even more cities. So it's very overwhelming to us, and we need guidance and leadership from you, but I would say getting that awareness level up may better leverage all the good work that we've already talked about.
We'll talk.
So for that, I live in New York and New York City. So as far as the local, state, and national is concerned, 9/11 happened. It was a really real thing. And I'm not sure that we actually learned anything from that. Hospitals are 24 hours, 7 days a week, 365 days. How do you do an emergency preparedness exercise with a city that on a weekday during rush hour, during 9 to 5, has 7 million people in it? How do you make all of that happen where people can get to a safe place or whatever the situation is? So that's something else that needs to be addressed in big cities, smaller towns, things like that, and on the local level. And then as far as the state and national, it's like Josh says, we just need to work up or down, but we need to work on it.
Do we have any other questions? Welcome, Josh.
Oh, hi.
Do you have some additional questions or topics you want to bring to the table?
Well, since I don't know what was already covered and you guys are all so brilliant, I'm assuming you covered it all. Someone tell me if this was already covered, but I think the hardest part and one of the big risk areas we have is I think it's good that we've gotten more of a positive attitude towards an embrace of the value of white hat research or good guys. I think some of us are jumping too soon to wanting it perfect. And what we saw working with Alan Friedman in his NTA process is that people are at different parts of their journey. So while the disclosure wars and debates are 20 years old for most of us, a lot of these safety critical industries are at year one, and they have to kind of crawl, then walk, then run. And what we've been trying to do is get them on the crawl stage and then hope that there's a virtuous upward spiral, that they'll add some more nuance or some better legal language or more safe harbor clauses and whatnot. So I call it being patiently impatient. And there's some people in the room that we've been trying to work on for a couple of years to get them to do their very first coordinated vulnerability disclosure template. And it was really helpful when Commerce Department put their seal on it. And it was really helpful when Suzanne before that said, we really treasure the value of white hat researchers, please start these programs. And we are making strides, but I think to get to that next level of adoption, we have to almost think like a product manager and look at what are the use cases that are keeping them from doing so. What's that one little stuttering block? Because in a lot of these cases, it's one little phrase in the NCI template that prevented them from having any program. So you know what we started doing? We said, just cut that line. I would prefer you have it, but cut that line. Get started. Because when you have your first program, and you have your first taste of success, and when it doesn't explode, then your internal confidence goes up and your internal political capital goes up. And I think sometimes we're so frustrated that we haven't been embraced, we want more than they're capable of giving us. So sometimes going slower actually makes you go faster. And I want us to have some level of relentless attachment to the goal of high trust and high collaboration between researchers and bug receivers. I also want us to have a pragmatism to us that gets us there faster. Sometimes, slow is smooth, smooth is fast, and we haven't really demonstrated that patience. A little bit of patience up front tends to start the process, and then you can accelerate into the curve. And I think we have a lot of proof points to that effect, but that's kind of what I wanted to add is I just started my own coordinated disclosure program now that I'm back in the private sector. It was hard to get through the general counsel, really hard. But we got something through, and I narrowed the scope down to maybe one product. And someone could criticize that from the outside and say it's not perfect, but I think that patience, when the first few disclosures we're getting in right now aren't going to backfire, people are like, oh, this isn't so bad. Oh, I can see the value in this. And then you can expand from there. So we have to look at this as more of a marathon and not a sprint. And I ask my hacker colleagues is don't be so purist about it and don't overplay the trust we started to experience, but help people get where we want them to get by understanding where they are. They have their current state, we have a desired state, we have to build a bridge from that current state to desired state, and it's often not one maneuver. I think the people in this room know that. They want to use the empathy and the patience. And I wanted to go a lot faster than many of us have experienced, but I think if you squint, we have a graphic that Nue made for us that showed like 18 parts of the U.S. government in a 2-year period enthusiastically embracing the value of coordinated vulnerability disclosure. I said this earlier this morning, but if you weren't here, Art Manion did a Senate testimony a couple weeks back about the Spectre meltdown disclosures. And both the chairman and the ranking minority both implicitly articulated, almost perfectly and implicitly articulated the value of white hat research. They were actually critical of the response from industry. And what a victory in a 5-year span to go from hackers or criminals to a gimme for elected officials in the Senate to understand the value of research. So I think on the arc of history, we're doing the right things. What I want to encourage you guys to do is don't drop the empathy that got us this progress. Don't give up on the goal, but don't drop the empathy that got us here. I think that's why we built trust with Suzanne and her team, and that trust, hard-earned, has turned into significant secondary effects where Congress is like, we really like this. Maybe other parts of the federal government should do what Suzanne's doing. So I hope that wasn't redundant with what was previously covered, but I think we're doing the right thing the right way, and we have to have realistic timelines on it. I don't think we should be arbitrarily patient, but we should understand where our teammates are at and help them cross that next hurdle. Is that redundant?
No.
Okay, good.
Yes.
Hi, Seth Rosenblatt from the Parallax. So there was a bit of media criticism leveled earlier, and I'm not going to defend my colleagues in the Fourth Estate, but I do think there's a lack of clear communication on what constitutes a critical vulnerability in a device versus a vulnerability that's important to be aware of, but perhaps is not as severe as some of the others that are out there. And as somebody who writes about this stuff on a regular basis, even I find it confusing to and unclear to try and figure out what's a serious vulnerability and what is less serious. And I'm curious what's being done to help clarify that beyond this room.
Well, that's definitely something that I had a huge amount of consideration when I disclosed my Johnson & Johnson work. One of the things that I learned in this process, when I disclosed the stuff in 2011 with the Medtronic insulin pump, I just thought it would be a cool black hat talk that all my geeky nerd friends would enjoy learning about how I found out about this. And when the media got a hold of it, it became this really big thing. And I got emails from all over the world, from parents, from doctors, from hospitals that wanted to know what they should do. Does this mean I need to wrap my kid's insulin pump in aluminum foil? Does this mean they need to go back to doing shots? What does this mean? I don't understand what this vulnerability means. I learned a lot from that, and the second time around, when I did work with Johnson & Johnson, I said, I want to make sure that people understand what this means. And I wrote a big blog post that got posted the same time that we did the disclosure, and I said, as a patient and as a parent, I implore you to keep your child on this insulin pump if you're affected by this vulnerability, because if I had to choose right now to keep myself or my children on this insulin pump, even with the vulnerability, I would still do it. Yes, the vulnerability is bad, but we have to realize that vulnerabilities and risk are relative. I mean, we take a risk when we fly to Las Vegas to go to this conference. Now, some people choose not to fly. Some people choose to drive because it's a different type of risk that they're comfortable with. But I think that making consumers more aware and more comfortable with what that risk and vulnerability means is really important. And part of that's the researcher's job. I need to tell patients, hey, this is a really technical thing that's probably never, ever going to happen to you, but it's still something that we need to be aware of and we need to fix.
I think we just got the 5-minute warning, but a small answer is tomorrow we have Art Manion from CertCC, Tom Millar from DHS, who's technically the sponsor of CVE, which leverages CVSS, myself, some other folks. We're going to kind of drill into some of the strengths and weaknesses of that, but one of the big problems is CVSS is kind of really not well oriented for the Common Vulnerability Scoring System is poorly oriented for safety critical use cases. We tend to focus on remote code execution or loss of intellectual property as opposed to an availability attack, which might be a fatality in some of these. So it's not that you can't score properly with the system, it's that they tend not to. So we're going to talk about and press upon some of those weaknesses and a much better answer to some of your question. Did you guys cover the SimSab? I mean, because I think part of the answer to this might be what Chairman Gottlieb is talking about with SimSab.
Yeah. No, we didn't. We actually didn't get to talk about the safety action plan, but as we move forward at the FDA in furthering the work that, in building upon the work that's already been done, we put out in the safety action plan that came out in April of this year some specific steps that we're looking to move forward with. And one of them is this concept, this notion of a public-private partnership model that would bring together experts across multiple disciplines working in a trusted environment in order to evaluate, to assess a vulnerability and to really get to ground truth around that vulnerability and closer to real time. And this is kind of in response to some of our own observations and learnings, quite a few of them which have been public, in terms of the time frame that it has taken to really get to ground truth around certain very, I would call them, high impact or high consequence vulnerabilities were they to be exploited. So, what this would do would really allow for creating an environment that you have disciplines such as the clinical discipline, the biomed discipline, the security engineering discipline, really working together and having access all to the same information and being able to really thoroughly assess and comprehend what is the impact of that vulnerability and what is the exploitability, of that vulnerability as well, in terms of then helping support what needs to be done in managing that vulnerability. I think that that is, a really key piece as we move forward. In that, right now, we're left with certain pockets where resources just are scarce in terms of being able to achieve that kind of ground truth, certainly in a timely manner.
So I got the sign that we're out of time. Please take advantage in the hallway, though. This is the start of the conversation, at the end, with Suzanne or Seth. Raise your hand. Seth's going to be on the panel tomorrow about CVE and CVSS.
Thanks for remembering, Josh.
I just did. But, if you have burning questions or topics on this, I think the SimSab, especially, is there a hacker voice on the SimSab?
There will be.
There will be. All right.
I mean, more than one.
Yeah. I mean, this is, if you're here this morning, if there's a pacemaker attack, do people get tired? Or is there a loss of life potential? And I think something like this stands a good chance to get past the noise and the posturing towards actual ground truth. So thanks for your time. I think this is the end of the track today. But please avail of the opportunity of two very senior people in the FDA here to answer your questions and be good colleagues. Thank you.